Hello, thank you for joining us to Ask Dr. Shana. Before we begin, I want to ask all of our viewers to please look on the screen right now and email your comments and suggestions for another show to Dr. D-O-C-T-O-R, Shana, S-H-A-N-A, Clark, C-L-A-R-K, 1 at gmail.com. Dr. Clark would love to hear your ideas and comments. And with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Shana. What are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about hanging on through what may seem like a very long wait to get back to normal ability to get together with our friends and to go places when we feel like it and so on. In other words, it's a question of lasting longer than we are required to last, if you follow me. Lasting out until they say, okay, you can go back to doing what you were doing. I feel motivated. I've heard several programs on the radio which emphasize the detrimental effect on the mental health of teenagers, particularly teenagers and young adults, of the restrictions that are placed on us now. I would like to point out that everybody is still free to email each other. They are free to telephone each other. There are such things as group where everybody can be on the phone call at the same time. And so I wouldn't consider it nearly as bad as, say, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, where they were locked up without access to the outside world simply because of their ancestry. And because Americans did not feel they could trust people who looked Japanese but maybe had been born in this country and felt themselves to be American, to be loyal citizens. And there was no attempt to distinguish between those who had manifested by what they did some sign of disloyalty and those who were just as much American as you or I. I don't think we have to talk about great big trauma and mental illness becoming much more frequent among the generation that are now teens and young adults. At least not at this point, because our restrictions have been going on, shall we say, since January or February, and it is now May. So that's February, March, April, May, 4 months. Well, that's very little time. I mean, it's very frustrating. I'm not saying that I don't understand that it is extremely frustrating, but I don't think this is going to produce a generation of very mentally ill adults. I really think that's an exaggeration. Especially, as I said, since they can write to each other, they can email each other, they can phone each other. And if they want to plan it a little bit, they can meet in groups of 10 people or less. Mm-hmm. So they just have to plan who they invite and stick to those people. And from my point of view as a doctor, insist that everybody has a face mask on.
Who has concerns about mental illness for teenagers and young adults? I hadn't heard this. So
Well, I listen mostly to public radio, and they had a number of counselors for young people who expressed grave concern and who made it out that we should expect to have a cohort of very unbalanced, mentally ill people that would be much larger than the small percentage of people who become mentally ill in any generation. And I just think that maybe out of concern they're exaggerating things, because in actual fact it's been 4 months. Now, if we were going to talk about a couple of years, maybe, but I don't hear of too many young people who contact some of their peers and agree to meet up somewhere, provided the total number is less than 10. You can have a lot of fun with 9 friends. So this isn't an absolute. And the thing is to avoid hugs and kisses and embraces and so on. And I suppose we might be getting to ways of expressing affection which do not involve actually touching the other party. That's also something that's been mentioned. And we may become a culture in which people bow to each other rather than shaking hands, for example. That to me would be a change, but I'm not going to lose sleep over it. As long as people feel that they have been thanked and appreciated and acknowledged, the actual body movements that are required for that are secondary. As long as everybody knows that, for example, bowing to someone is to show them a sign of respect and appreciation. I know that there are young people who are very frustrated and perhaps resentful of not being allowed the crowd scenes. They're not allowed the concerts in which hundreds or thousands of people sang along the chorus of a song or something. But that's, it seems to me, a poor excuse for saying the entire generation is going to be majorly traumatized. And I think we just need to be able to adapt more and more satisfyingly than we have before. Now, the people that I feel sorrow and chagrin for are the people who have some older person in the family die and they can't have the usual funeral with extended family invited and everybody comes. But there's no reason why they couldn't, for instance, if there are 6 people who are still alive who would normally participate in this funeral, well, there's nothing to say that the 6 people can't each invite 9 people, and so they would get together in groups of 10 to celebrate, to mourn and celebrate the death of their relative. I mean, it's just a matter of thinking it through. And there's Skype. You could have, if some of the people were in another part of the country, you could say hello to them on Skype, as long as there's no group of 10 or more. And the solemn goodbye that a funeral entails could be done over some period of time, which might be just as well anyway, because I've had in my career as a public sector psychiatrist, I've had a lot of people describe to me, well, my grandfather died, and 3 days later we had his funeral, and then the day after the funeral I woke up and I didn't know what to do with myself, because apparently the funeral was over, and yet I didn't feel it was over, and it was a very uncomfortable time. So maybe spreading the funeral out over a period of a couple of weeks, shall we say, wouldn't be such a bad thing. Anyway, someone who has already had a person in the family die probably is a whole lot more attuned to the idea of wearing a face mask and doing as we are asked to do, staying away from crowds, than a person who has never been touched by the coronavirus thing. And we don't know if this is going to disappear. It may not. Or there may be several other new microbes. I should perhaps mention something that nobody is mentioning, which is that deforestation, cutting down trees all over the globe, makes, and cutting down the habitat of bats and other creatures, makes the bats or whatever creatures are displaced more likely to come into contact with humans, and more likely to share their viruses or whatever. Part of it is that the population of Earth, the human population of Earth, has become, I think we're up to something like 9 billion. And other creatures are forced into proximity with us, and the viruses which a bat may have had for thousands of years and gives the bat no more than equivalent of a common cold, suddenly is thrust into contact with a human being. So it's something we did, and possibly something we could decide not to contribute so much to. In other words, don't cut down the Amazon rainforest. Don't cut down age-old forests in other parts of the world and force their creatures into closer contact with people. And because there are, most species of the world have bacteria or viruses or microscopic creatures of one kind or another that infect them. And what we are doing is putting ourselves into closer proximity to these other creatures who have all those viruses and things. We all also need to get all the countries of the world to have a plan for the next coronavirus that erupts somewhere, so that it doesn't spread all over the world and be killing people all over the world. That would be more of a concern to me than thinking that 4 months or 5 months or 6 months of young people having somewhat limited contact with other young people is going to make our younger generation be a bunch of crazies. I have more faith in our young people than that. I think they can understand what's going on. Now, smaller children may have difficulty understanding why Grandpa's funeral can't be everybody comes. And their parents or their teachers need to explain to them. And also, if a person has more time by themselves than they used to, maybe they could work on that hobby that they'd always been wanting to get to but never had the time. Maybe people who are learning to play a musical instrument could actually have more time to practice. It is not a bad idea to look at every adversity and say, okay, I know what the downside of this is. Now, what opportunity does it bring me that I wouldn't have without it? And then that will help one to feel more optimistic and to cope better. And I also will say one more time, I've said it on previous episodes, but I'll say it one more time, and then I promise I won't say it again. Americans should perhaps use this time of terrible adversity to learn what the advantage would have been had they been savers. The Japanese routinely save 10 to 15% of their income. And so if they lose their job or the company goes out of business and they lose their job, I mean, I realize most of the job loss is not because of poor function on part of the workers or making the boss angry with them or something. It's because the whole industry is, and the whole economy is suffering terribly. But if individuals had saved, since they started working, 10 to 15% of their income, they wouldn't be, as a lady who was on the radio the other day was. She said she lost her job. She put in for unemployment, but it hadn't arrived yet. And she said somewhat dramatically that she was facing starvation. Now, there is a food pantry in her community, and all you have to do is show up and wait in line, and you will get some food, and it will be nutritious food. I'm not saying that these times aren't very hard times. I'm just saying that if we constantly tell ourselves this is a catastrophe, we're going to be much more severely affected than we would if we said to ourselves, well, this is certainly something we weren't expecting, and it's a very nasty surprise, but we'll make it.
There are opportunities for us.
Yes. And we will all last. There are, and there have been for centuries, I think, people in this country who go to bed hungry, which I think is scandalous. And I support several food bank style organizations to try and correct that. But we don't die of starvation in this country. And I think it's fairly safe to say that's not going to happen. One of the things that's pleasant that is happening is that people are becoming much more neighborly than they were. They take an interest in their neighbor across the hall or down the street, in helping them just to help them. And then it often happens that the situation is reversed and it's the helper who needs help. But the neighbor who has been helped will willingly come and help out the person who needs it. And I think this kind of practical generosity is what we need to put an emphasis on. So, and as soon as you get to better financial times, start saving. Because you never know in this life. There are lots of surprises. Some of them are wonderful. I'm going to be the great aunt of a grandniece shortly. And some of them are not so wonderful, and some of them are just awful. But the only thing you can say of an old person, I don't know, theoretically now, medicine defines old as over the age of 85. If they died recently, well, they might have lived longer, but on the other hand, if they're in their 90s, death is one of the things that's going to come, and it's going to come to all of us. So let's try and be kinder and more adept at taking advantage of the things we can do, and more appreciative, perhaps, of the efforts of other people.
And I think that is a wonderful place for us to leave our viewers. It's optimistic, it's what we can do, it's taking the bad and looking for the opportunities, all coming together. And this has been a wonderful, wonderful time. Any last thoughts?
Well, I do wish some of my viewers would contact me. I replied to a viewer who did and put my phone number. I also said that 9 to 11 a.m. on Eastern Standard Time is the best time to reach me. For some reason, all my appointments tend to be in the afternoon. But I wish people would maybe come up with a topic that they would like me to discuss. And keep in mind, your life is not over. You are going to go on, and so don't stand in your own, blocking your way to your own future, because complaining about things is just spending psychic energy on something that will get you nothing. Find a solution, find a new way of contacting someone, maybe a new way of showing them that you appreciate them, and you've done something. So, until next week, and make it a good week, or as good as you can.